Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Small Axe Education. Let's talk about it. So Education is the final installment into Steve McQueen's Small Axe limited anthology series. Now this has been a series that has been centered around the Caribbean community that lived here in the UK between 1960 to the 1980s. This episode specifically, Steve McQueen decided to focus on the topic of education. And I have to tell you straight off the bat that this was one of the most impactful, emotional, powerful episodes that this series has yet to deliver. I was so emotionally moved by this episode. Truly, this shot right up to the top of my favorite episodes of this entire anthology series. So I can't wait to get into my thoughts on this one with you guys. But before I do so, just a friendly little reminder, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado, let's get into this one. Like I mentioned, in this episode we explored the environment of the educational system during the period of the 1960s to the 1980s, but really this extended towards the entire generation, the Windrush generation, that were affected by this education system that existed here in the UK during this time. And inevitably this also ended up having some generational effects for future generations, be it the children and the grandchildren of those affected during this Windrush generation. And as a result, we see these attitudes being passed down through generations, and that very much impacted the way that the school system exists even to this day. Now, this is such a complex conversation that is had in this episode, which is what really made it so powerful and really thought-provoking. I'm going to be diving into some of these thematic elements in this review, even more so than I usually do for these episodes, simply because of the complexity that we are working with, and also because I felt personally affected by this episode. As someone who has tutored many kids for the last few years, there were moments in this episode where I was literally in tears, because to see the impact of the racial bias that existed in the educational system during this time and the way that it's reflected in the educational system that we have today, it really broke my heart. So we're going to be going through this theme, and then we'll talk more specifically about the episode, the cast, the characters, the writing later on as we go down the review. Firstly, a lot of what is explored in this episode in terms of its analysis of the educational system that existed during this time actually stems from a book written by a Grenadian writer who was called Bernard Coward. He explored this topic famously in his book titled How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System. This is such a groundbreaking novel because it recognized some of the themes and some of the trends that were occurring across the UK, and specifically targeted towards Black children, and especially West Indian children who had migrated from the West Indies or had been called by their parents after a few years when they'd been able to settle down, have enough money, have a house in order to support their families. As a result of this entire immigration process that I just talked about, a lot of Black kids ended up going into school, into the British educational system, and they unfortunately were met with a ton of systematic racism that had a huge effect on the quality of education that they received. And one such measure that was actually a symptom of this inequality in the quality of education received by Black children was actually presented as a solution for the problem, and that was these schools that were directed towards children who were deemed educationally subnormal. These children would be put under such categories as a result of their teachers' assessments and also use of IQ testing. Now, in terms of the teacher assessment, you already know, you can already predict if you have a racist society that is so committed and so driven towards perpetuating these racist stereotypes about Black children and about Black people and where they come from and what they are capable of. You already know there's going to be some racial biases in these teachers' assessments, number one. Then you also have the IQ testing, which, as someone who studied psychology in A-level, we already covered how IQ tests can be culturally biased. That is a huge issue with them, is that they're a measure of intelligence, but they're based off of Western knowledge. So how can you measure intelligence in someone who doesn't have that Western background? There's a huge cultural bias in IQ testing. And so to put these two together and create this report of a child who is just deemed unmanageable, rowdy, loud, and these often disproportionately affected, of course, black children, it was just a recipe for disaster. And it meant that these black kids ended up going to these special schools that actually had no interest in educating them. And as a result, they would come out with very few qualifications or low-level qualifications. Therefore, they were deemed unqualified for the higher paying, more prosperous career choices. This consequently, as you could probably already tell, would lead to a lot of black children growing up and having low-paying jobs. Therefore, this cycle of poverty and inequality would just become perpetuated. This is the system that existed back in those days, and it's just so heartbreaking to see how so many children of migrants who had travelled to the UK upon the government's request, might I add, we'll talk about that later on, but they travelled to the UK for better life prospects, to give their kids a better life, to follow a dream for their families, and they ended up finding out that their kids were actually being enrolled in an educational system that was working against them, actively working against them and seeing to their failure. That is just absolutely heartbreaking. We've seen a ton of examples throughout this series of racial prejudice and racial bias and the effect that can have on society, but the difference here is that it is focused on children. This episode focuses on the impact that all of those socio-political factors can have on these children and their educational needs, and that's what really just makes it so much more emotionally impactful for me personally. Another thing to note here is that because these children are the victim of this form of prejudice and discrimination, they really have no power in this system, because a lot of the power is supposed to come from their teachers and their parents. Now, in the case of the teachers, I already spoke about the racial biases that existed in the society that would have inevitably affected the way that the teachers acted towards students. They would pick on them far more. We still see this to this day, where black kids are seen as just inherently more violent, more rowdy, more, irresponsible, and they don't care about their education, and therefore teachers will act accordingly. This episode, as well as the book, brilliantly explores the idea of cause and effect. What is the cause and effect here? If the teacher already believes you to be stupid, to be inherently subhuman, subpar, in comparison with the rest of your white classmates, then you're going to start acting as such. You're going to start acting accordingly, and you will see the degradation of the quality of education that you receive at that institution. At the same time, you also see a case where there was no cultural teaching, there was no sensitivity teaching during this time. So teachers were addressing students with accents and students with different needs, students who had come from different countries across the globe. These teachers were dismissing such students as being stupid or incapable just because they came from cultures and ethnic backgrounds that they didn't understand, that were the majority in this country. Now, all of this would have inevitably created a great sense of lack of self-esteem within these black students. They would have felt like they had no hope, that they had no prospects. No one was encouraging them to do better. No one was showing them the possibilities that they could achieve if they just got the help that they needed, the support that they needed from their schools in order to get the best possible grades, to give them the qualifications that would open doors for them. No one was doing that, and you can't even begin to imagine how important it is, especially at a younger age, to have that support system in the institution. It's not enough to have it just at home, because your parents might mean well, but they don't know how the system works. They don't know the inner workings of the educational system for the most part, unless they actually work there or they have connections. And we'll talk about the parents in a second, but in this case, it also shows how when you don't have the support system at school and you don't have it at home, it leaves the student feeling very lost and very hopeless. Like I just said, we can also dive into the parents here as well, because for some of the episode, I was actually quite angry at the parents. Truly, I was quite angry at them, but then I had to remember that these parents were just people who were looking for better prospects and a better life for their kids, for their families. They had been summoned to the UK by the Labour and Conservative governments so that they could perform the low-paying and labour-intensive jobs that, there was a huge gap in the labour force for. And as a result, these parents often were just worked to the bone. They were working working day in, day out, as we saw in a perfect example with the case of the child's mother in this episode, who just literally did not have the time. She didn't have the time. She was working 2 different jobs. It seems that she was working as a nurse or some sort of healthcare practitioner, which we often see with the Black community, especially with Black women working as nurses or working as, healthcare assistants. And also she seemed to be working as a cleaner at some point as well, or a housekeeper. So she really did not have the time to be dealing with the intricacies of her children's education. She kind of left that to them, and that's unfortunate for the child, but it doesn't act as a commentary on her parenting skills at all. Even though I was upset at first, just seeing her situation and the fact that she had to work so hard to keep that roof over their heads, to make sure they had, their school clothes, and make sure they had everything that they needed for their school, and make sure that they were able to come home to a nice warm meal. These responsibilities must have been so overwhelming that having anything in addition to that would just be unimaginable. But at some point in the episode, thank goodness, she is made aware of her son's plight at school after he changes school, and she does become extremely proactive, and she takes the time to focus on bettering her son's educational experience, because that's what's necessary. She has to take it into her own hands. And that's something that the book also covers, is the idea that, parents play such an important role. But it's this double-edged sword where you have a racist society that is built to be against Black people as a whole, not just Black children, remember? And so these Black people are working so hard in these low-paying jobs, so they often don't have time to be keeping on top of every single little thing that their kids are going through. And then you also have kids who have a low self-esteem to begin with, because they aren't being encouraged at school, and as a result, when they get home, maybe their parents don't have time to listen to what they have to say, and they just feel like they're being supported by no one, which just worsens the situation for them and ends up with them not doing very well at school. Another additional layer that this episode and the book add to this issue surrounding, children's educational needs and how they weren't met by the system during this time is the idea that the parents also needed time and energy and money to organize themselves. The Caribbean parents of this community needed to find a way to organize themselves and create a community in order to support their kids' learning, so that they could supplement whatever was missing from their education in these schools. So these Caribbean parents that came together and formed, for example, Saturday schools, which my friend even told me she still attended during my time, during our generation. These Saturday schools would be so incredibly instrumental in helping to supplement what was missing from these kids' education in these normal British schools. And also this organization was instrumental in making sure that these parents' needs were heard by the authorities and the government. We see in this episode that Lydia, the community activist who brings the parents together, ends up advising Agnes to write a letter to the Secretary of Education, because the time to appeal her son's move to that school for the educationally subnormal has elapsed. Now, during this time, as is mentioned in the episode, the Secretary of Education is actually Margaret Thatcher, which is we could go through all of the complex issues surrounding Margaret Thatcher's policy on the increase in ethnic diversity in this country during her time as Prime Minister in another video. For this video, she's just started her role as the Secretary of Education. And it's really interesting to see how, because of this community that has been formed in the Caribbean community in order to support the educational needs of the children, parents were able to exchange more information and exchange knowledge that they have of the educational system in order to empower other parents and therefore empower the community as a whole, which, like I said, was growing at this time and therefore gaining more political influence. Finally, in relation to the theme that is explored in this episode, the educational system that existed back in those days that affected so many Black students that were coming in from immigrant families, I also wanted to touch on the fact that, a lot of that really hasn't changed even now. This isn't something that is explored in the episode strictly, although perhaps it could have been. A lot of that has remained the same, even though the language that is used in education has changed. They no longer use terms like educationally subnormal or mentally subnormal, which was the precursor to that term. These terms are just so disparaging and demeaning, but now they have terms like special educational needs, and you can question, how different each of those terms are. You can go into the psychology of child development and teaching and explore just how much things have changed and how things will stay the same, especially in relation to how, Black kids or people of color specifically are treated in the education system in this country. But I have to say that after watching this episode, I sadly saw so many similarities similarities to what I have experienced at school with black classmates, or my brothers even have experienced directly, in terms of being constantly targeted by teachers simply because they have this preconceived notion that black kids are just rowdier, they make so much more trouble, they're unmanageable. As a result, fewer teachers are able to see the academic potential in these students, and they end up just getting told off and excluded. There's a huge movement about the exclusion rates and how it disproportionately affects black kids in this country, but they just end up being excluded, or they get sent to pupil referral units, which are essentially centers for kids or people in education that are deemed, unmanageable to work within a regular school. All of this is just to highlight how important and how relevant the topics that are explored in this week's episode really are, even to this day, and how the generational effect of how the Windrush generation's children's educational needs weren't met as they should have can definitely be seen today in their children and their grandchildren. That's probably why, even though there has been some developments in the policies by the Board of Education, we're still seeing a lot of similarities to the approaches that were taken by the educational professionals towards black children and children that are deemed just too rowdy based on racial biases, in comparison to the policies that we saw about 40 years ago that were explored in this episode. So speaking of the episode itself, I did want to dive into the other aspects of it that I very much enjoyed, other than the socio-political commentary, which pretty much has taken up the majority of this review, but I just felt so passionately about what was explored here. But anyways, I also wanted to mention just how brilliant the cast was in this episode. Truly, Kenya Sandy, who portrays Kingsley in this episode, his performance was just on another level. Okay, this child actor, he nailed it, because he had to portray a boy who clearly was suffering from some sort of dyslexia, or maybe he didn't even have dyslexia, but he's just been so behind in his reading for so long, and no one wanted to help him in school, that he was just behind for his year group. But I do think that it is suggested that he may have had dyslexia, even though he's a very bright kid, and nonetheless. But the performance the performance here was just so heartbreaking. Okay, it was definitely a tearjerker, because I was crying. The scene where he is struggling to read, his mother has asked him to read a passage from a book because she suddenly has her eyes open to what is happening to her son, and he is struggling to read that passage. Best believe I was tearing up. I have no idea what was going on screen, because I was tearing up. That was just so emotionally impactful. That was so raw. I felt the mother's pain in that moment. Jeez, wow. Truly just wow. Also want to give all the props in the world to Charlene White, who portrays Agnes Smith, his mother. She brilliantly personified what is basically a whole group within the Caribbean community of black women who are just working so hard day in, day out in order to provide for their families. They're working these labor-intensive, low-paying jobs that see them be so busy that they're not able to pay attention to every minute detail in their children's lives. When she does have that revelation, thanks to Lydia, who we'll talk about in a second, she is able to just become so much more proactive. She takes all the measures necessary to ensure that her child's educational needs are met, and it is just so truly inspiring. And finally, as I mentioned, I also wanted to spotlight Josette Simon, who portrays Lydia. Now, this is the woman who gives Agnes the book, the all-important book that explains to her exactly what is going on and how this educational system is failing these black children, especially children from the West Indies. And at that moment, it is a huge watershed moment in Agnes's life and in the family life of the Smiths overall. And Lydia plays such a crucial role in that. And the actress who portrays her is just phenomenal. That scene that she has where she's in this hall and she's talking to other members of the West Indian community about what's happening to their children in these schools is just so powerful. You can feel the hurt that she has, because she's gone through this through personal experience with her own children, and you can see the determination that she also has to ensure that this doesn't happen to future generations and to other people's children within their community. Overall, yes. Absolutely, yes. This was one of, if not the best episode of the entire Small Acts series. This is what I have been looking for when it comes to Small Acts. I've said in my previous reviews that I was slightly disappointed, slightly perturbed by the fact that I didn't really get that cinematic quality, that emotional impact that I was waiting for when I found out that Small Acts was going to be created by Steve McQueen and he was going to be presenting us with these stories. But now, having seen this episode, honestly, I just kind kind of have to double down on what I said, because after having seen what all of these episodes could have been, I just want more of this. I want more of this emotional rawness. I want more of this expose of this systematic racism that has existed in this country for decades now. And I want more of these characters that you can just connect with because they tell universally applicable stories. That's what I was looking forward to seeing in this series, and I'm so glad to say that the final episode of this anthology series definitely delivered on that. So with all of that being said, I'm going to give Education a 9 out of 10. So that puts me in a very tricky position because this is the final episode of the Small Axe Anthology series, at least for now, which means that I am going to be giving my rating overall of the entirety of this series. If you've been watching my reviews, you'll know that the majority of these episodes have gotten 7s. I need to give somewhat of an average for the overall series, even though I do think that this last episode really just kicked it up a notch by far. So with all of that taken into account, I'm going to be giving Steve McQueen's Small Axe a 7.5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Small Axe, Education, and the series overall, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this series and this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!